Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Claire. I'm joining you from my home since we have the coronavirus scare going on right now to add one little lecture about animal tissues, invertebrate animals in particular. So when we're talking about organismal biology, there's several different levels of organization that we can look at. You can look at the cellular level, and then you have multiple cells that come together to form tissues. Tissues are a group of different types of cells that serve a particular function. Those tissues then will come together to form an organ. So organs again are made up of several different types of tissue and serve some sort of particular function as well. And then your organs come together into organ systems. So for example, you could look at a cardiac muscle cell, and that single muscle cell then would be part of a cardiac muscle tissue, which then makes up the heart organ, which then is part of the circulatory system. And so those kinds of stacked levels of organization are very typical in a lot of biological questions. So what we're going to be talking about mostly today is different types of tissues. Now, you may remember from our lecture on categorizing animals that I talked about embryonic tissue layers. And there are, in vertebrates at least, there are 3 embryonic tissue layers. Vertebrates are triploblastic. So in the embryo, vertebrates have these 3 tissue layers: the ectoderm, the mesoderm, and the endoderm. Ectoderm's on the outside, mesoderm's in the middle, and endoderm's on the inside. Now, as the animal matures, those embryonic tissue types then also mature into adult tissue types. And so the adult tissue types we're going to be talking about today, there's 4 adult tissue types in vertebrates. Those are the epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And every vertebrate animal is made up of these 4 tissues. And in any given organ that you're looking at, you usually will find multiple of these different tissue types. So we're going to be talking about some characteristics of these different tissue types and just kind of giving you guys a general overview. So when you are looking at organs, you do tend to see that they are made up of multiple tissue types. For example, if you look at the stomach, there's epithelial tissue on the inside of the stomach. There's muscle tissue in the lining that allows the stomach to churn the food. There's connective tissue that holds the stomach together. There's nervous tissue that is sending signals about what's happening in the stomach to the rest of the body. So all of these different tissue types are working together to help the organ perform the function that it needs to. And then, of course, those organ systems are made up of multiple organs. So the digestive system isn't just the stomach. It also has the intestines and the esophagus and all of these other organs, each of which that are made up of the different tissue types. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the different tissue types. You do have the epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is generally the tissue that is between the body and the outside world. So skin is a really great example of epithelial tissue, but you also have epithelial tissue on the lining of your lungs, on the lining of your intestine. And again, what's in your digestive system is not part of you yet because you haven't absorbed it. So the epithelial tissue is between you and that other substance that's in the inside of your digestive tissue. Epithelial tissue can also form glands. So we're going to talk more about glands when we talk about the endocrine system. So you don't have to worry too much about that now, but just be aware that you do have epithelial tissue there as well. Cells from the epithelial tissue tend to be very tightly bound together because they are forming this protective layer between the body and the outside world. And then they're usually categorized by their general shape. So you can have broad, flat epithelial tissues, which we would refer to as squamous. You can have tall, skinny epithelial tissues, that would be referred to as columnar. And then you can have kind of roundish or squarish epithelial tissues, which would be an example of cuboidal epithelial tissue. You don't have to worry too much about categorizing them in too much detail for this class, but it's some terminology that you might run into somewhere else. Connective tissues are a very diverse group of tissues. So there are a lot of different types of connective tissue in the body, and the bulk of your body is made up of connective tissue. They tend to be derived from the embryonic mesoderm, and you can kind of group them into 2 major classes. You have connective tissue proper, which are going to be things like tendons and ligaments and the types of sheets of connective tissue that hold your organs together. And then you have special connective tissue. Special connective tissue is cartilage, bone, and blood. So the thing, all of those may seem like very different types of tissues. Like blood is clearly quite different from bone, which is clearly quite different from a tendon. But what all these connective tissues have in common is that they have an extracellular matrix. They have this substance that's outside of the cell that is not part of the cell. And that substance is what is a similarity between all connective tissues. So for example, in bone tissue, your extracellular matrix is going to be the actual bone itself, the calcium phosphate structure that makes up your bones. In blood, the extracellular matrix is actually a fluid. It's the plasma, the blood plasma, in which the cells are floating. So, and then in things like a ligament or a tendon, you have these extracellular strands of protein that are the extracellular matrix. So it just varies depending on the type of tissue. For muscle tissue, there's muscle tissue, of course, is the tissue that allows vertebrates to move. It's contractile, so that means that we can shorten it, and then it's usually attached to our bones, which is what allows us to move. Three major types of muscle tissue. You have a smooth muscle, skeletal muscle, and cardiac muscle. Smooth muscle is generally found along the digestive system and in the walls of your circulatory system, in the veins and arteries. And smooth muscle is not under your conscious control. It does contract, but it's contracting based on signals from your autonomic nervous system. We'll talk more about that later as well. The skeletal muscle tissue, that is the muscle tissue that is under your conscious control. It's the muscle tissue that moves your bones, and it's the most abundant type of muscle tissue in the body. Cardiac muscle tissue is specifically the muscle tissue in the heart. Again, not under your conscious control, because the autonomic nervous system actually controls your heart rate. All right, and then our last tissue type is nerve tissue. So nervous tissue includes neurons, which are the individual cells that send signals throughout the body. And the nervous tissue also includes the supporting cells called neuroglial cells. If you're looking at an individual neuron, and we're going to talk about this more when we have a whole lecture on the nervous system, but when you're looking at an individual neuron, you have the cell body, which is kind of the main body of the cell that contains the nucleus. And then branching off on one side of that are going to be a net of dendrites. Dendrites receive signals either from other neurons or from sensory cells. And then you have an axon, and the signal is received by the dendrite and then passed down the axon either to other nerve cells or muscle cells or glands. There's a number of different cell types at the end of the axon that can receive this signal. Again, we'll talk about this a bit more in our lecture on the nervous system. And then finally, the neuroglial cells. These are the support cells that protect the neurons. They tend to surround the axon. That axon is very long and skinny. In the case of some animals, the axon can actually be feet long. And so you've got to protect that delicate structure. And so the neuroglial cells form a myelin sheath around that axon and help to protect it from damage and keep the signals being sent down the axon contained within the myelin sheath as well. So that's it for this lecture. Hope you all are healthy and happy, and I will talk to you later. If I can figure out how to stop recording.